Hey guys, tonight we slip into the quiet glow of a Roman villa, the oil lamps casting soft halos against mosaic floors, and you find yourself staring at a folded piece of wool that is improbably the most important garment of an empire. This is not your comfy t-shirt. It's the toga. At first glance, it looks like someone's forgotten bedsheet. And yet, in the Roman world, it is the badge of citizenship, the uniform of respectability, and the most impractical thing you'll ever try to wrap around yourself. You probably won't survive a single day trying to live in one, what with its constant slipping, tripping, and need for attendants just to get dressed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling generous, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink, and the atrium's marble tiles feel cool under your bare feet. The murmur of fountains outside mixes with the faint smell of olive oil and dust. You pick up the folded cloth. It's heavier than you expect, 7 meters of wool, roughly the size of a modern bedsheet, set for a king-sized mattress. You wonder why on earth anyone thought this was a good idea. But in Rome, to wear a toga is to say, I belong. I am a citizen. I play by the rules. The mainstream fact historians agree that originally, in the early Republic, the toga was pretty much the only garment Roman men wore in public. Tunics were fine for the privacy of the home or the sweaty labor of farms, but when stepping into the forum, the toga was mandatory. Think of it like business suits for senators, except less practical and more woolly. The quirky tidbit, apparently, the toga may have started out as nothing more than a fancy blanket. Some early accounts suggest shepherds used to drape themselves in rough cloaks of wool for warmth at night, and the urban elites just polished up the look. So every senator strutting around the forum is in a way just an overconfident shepherd showing off his upgraded blanket. And the open scholarly debate historians still argue whether the toga was really comfortable in the Mediterranean climate. Some suggest the thick wool kept you cool by shading your skin like desert robes. Others point out that most wearers probably sweated through speeches while secretly wishing tunics were acceptable. No consensus, which means you can imagine senators standing there baking in the sun, pretending not to melt. You look out into the Roman street. Citizens bustle by, each toga folded differently depending on rank. White, broad, crisp folds mean a young man is coming of age. Purple edges mark officials with authority. A full purple toga, the picta, glitters with embroidery reserved for generals on their big day of triumph. The fabric whispers social status more loudly than any badge or ID card ever could. Of course, not everyone gets to wear one. Slaves' tunics only. Foreigners stick to your native dress. Women traditionally excluded, except in scandalous cases we'll get to later. The toga becomes a kind of gatekeeper who counts as Roman enough to be draped in wool. You run your hands over the edge of the cloth. It's smoother than you expected, not scratchy. You imagine the loom that wove it, the weaver, leaning over, shuttling threads back and forth, hours of labor to create something that might fall off you the moment you sneeze, and you chuckle quietly, Rome, master of engineering aqueducts and roads, still made its citizens walk around in a blanket that refused to stay on. The villa grows hushed, and in that stillness you picture yourself stepping outside the toga, clutched awkwardly, half afraid it will unravel in front of the neighbors. A little boy runs past in a tunic, laughing freely, and you envy him. But as you catch sight of a senator raising his hand in debate, you feel the weight of the garment settle on your shoulders. It's not just wool. It's history, identity, duty, folded, tucked, and draped into existence. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you think maybe, just maybe, you can survive the night in this toga, though walking upstairs might be another story. The night lingers in that Roman villa, and as you shuffle in your woolly cocoon, your thoughts drift back to the sheep that made it all possible. Every toga, after all, begins not in some senator's wardrobe, but on a hillside dotted with bleeding creatures that look suspiciously smug about their role in empire building. You trail after a shepherd up in the Apennine Hills, his flock grazing lazily, and you realize your toga is basically just an argument between a sheep and a loom with you stuck in the middle. The mainstream fact here is simple: Roman wool was prized throughout the Mediterranean. The sheep of Italy produced fibers that, when carefully spun, could be soft, lustrous, and surprisingly durable. Writers like Varro and Columella, who you'd think had better things to do, actually recorded advice about breeding sheep, specifically for better wool. Yes, Roman agronomists were basically ancient textile influences, the quirky tidbit dye pits. You wander into a Roman dye workshop, and the smell hits you like a wall. Bright reds from madder root, deep yellows from saffron indigo, imported across the seas, and that luxurious purple made from thousands of crushed sea snails. The process is messy, loud, and definitely not what you'd call spa-like. Workers stir vats with long poles, and you're standing there realizing your elegant toga might have spent its youth soaking in something that smells suspiciously fishy. So much for glamour. Historians still argue whether most citizens actually wore undyed wool or whether brighter togas were more common than we think. In art, we see a lot of clean white, but pigments were available and markets were lively. Some scholars believe everyday Romans might have liked a bit of color, just not the elite who clung to pure white as the symbol of status. You can imagine debates happening in the textile stalls. This year, off-white is the new white. You shuffle closer to the loom, where spinners are hard at work. Women mostly sit with distaffs and spindles, twisting the fibers into threads. Their fingers move quickly, almost hypnotically, and the whir of the spindle is the ancient equivalent of white noise. You watch as skeins of yarn are dyed, rinsed, and stretched across wooden frames. It takes days of patient labor, but the cloth slowly grows long enough for a toga's immense length. As you run your hand along the woven fabric, you notice how soft the inner side feels compared to the outer. Some togas were brushed to give a smoother finish. Others left coarse, depending on the owner's wealth. And just when you're beginning to feel a bit impressed by Roman craftsmanship, a worker casually mentions the use of urine as a mordant in dyeing. Yes, the chemical fixative came straight from amphorae left on street corners for public collection. Suddenly, your toga feels less pristine and more rustic. You chuckle quietly, telling yourself, well, at least it's organic. The workshop is lively. Someone cracks a joke about sheep being Rome's true senators since everyone follows their lead. Another worker complains that their hands will smell like dye for days. You watch children run errands with baskets of wool, a small reminder that the empire's grandeur depended on families steeped in very ordinary, very smelly tasks. You step outside squinting against the Roman sun. Traders unload bales of cloth from faraway lands, Egyptian linen, Eastern silks, but wool remains king in the toga business. Roman citizens are expected to wear wool, not silk, which is dismissed as decadent, foreign, and unmanly, though secretly many wealthy Romans adored silk. It's just that you couldn't exactly march into the forum shimmering like a butterfly without attracting a few sarcastic comments from poets. Your toga, freshly woven and dyed, is carried home by a servant who grumbles under the weight. 7 meters of cloth doesn't sound like much until you realize it's basically hauling a small carpet. And you think to yourself, this empire is run not by soldiers or senators, but by the quiet labor of sheep shepherds, dyers, and weavers. Without them, Rome would be naked, quite literally. As night falls, the wool dries on wooden racks, the dye is set, and the toga to be lies ready. You rest your hand on its edge, and for the first time you notice something strange, a faint smell of lanolin, the sheep's natural oil clinging stubbornly to the threads. It's oddly comforting, like a reminder of the hills and fields where it all began. And as the sound of the loom fades into the background, you realize you're slowly being wrapped not just in wool, but in the everyday lives of countless Romans who made sure the empire looked the part, one fold at a time. The toga, now freshly woven, doesn't simply leap from loom to glory. It must be washed, pressed, and shaped into something wearable, though wearable is generous. You follow it into the Fulanica, the Roman laundry, a bustling establishment where the reality of toga care comes into full, pungent view. Here's the mainstream fact. Fullers were professionals who specialized in cleaning and finishing woolen garments. They handled everything from everyday tunics to senatorial togas, and they used a method that, brace yourself, involved vats of water clay and human urine. You stand in the entryway, the smell thick enough to make your eyes water, watching workers stomp barefoot in great tubs, garments swirling around them like some twisted version of a grape harvest. The quirky tidbit that makes you smirk the urine wasn't just collected randomly. Rome had designated jars placed on street corners, and citizens contributed freely. Emperor Vespasian even taxed this humble resource, leading to his famous quip, "Money doesn't stink." You picture him saying this while holding his nose, and you can't help but think Rome was the original circular economy. Historians still argue whether all garments were processed with urine or if it was mainly for whitening and degreasing. Some suggest finer togas, especially for the elite, may have skipped the stinkier steps, relying instead on fuller's earth or clay with natural cleansing properties. But the evidence is patchy, so you're left imagining some unlucky slave being told to stomp an especially foul batch just because the senator had a banquet tomorrow. You linger near one of the tubs. The workers, used to the stench, barely flinch as they slosh garments around with poles, then stomp them rhythmically like a team of human washing machines. Children dart between the tubs carrying buckets, splashing water that leaves dark streaks across the stone floor. You notice a few togas pinned up to dry in the sun, their fibers glistening faintly. The transformation is subtle. What entered limp and stained now emerges lighter, whiter, and faintly steaming in the warm Roman air. One fuller calls you over to watch the brushing. Garments are stretched across wooden frames, and stiff bristles are dragged over the fabric to raise the nap and give it that smooth, even look. You run your hand along one of them, surprisingly soft, though you keep wondering how much of that softness is thanks to sheep oil and how much to human feet. It's a tactile contradiction, part luxury, part laundry day, gone horribly wrong. Of course not everyone could afford such treatment. Some lower-class Romans probably just gave their wool a rinse at home or wore it until the smell matched everyone else in the street. But for a citizen's toga, especially if you wanted to show up at the forum without looking like you'd slept in a ditch, the Fullonica was the place to be. You can almost hear the gossip flowing as workers scrubbed and stomped political scandals, gladiator rumors, even complaints about whose urine was most effective. You think about modern dry cleaning tags that say, "Do not wash and smirk." Imagine dropping your garment at the Roman Fullonica and asking for delicate cycle only. They'd hand you a pole and point at the nearest vat. No refunds. You step outside grateful for fresh air, but still carrying the ghost of the smell with you. The toga now shines a brighter white proof of all that stomping and scrubbing. In fact, whiteness itself carried meaning. The toga candida worn by political candidates was whitened to an almost glowing brilliance, with chalk signaling purity and worthiness, at least in theory. You picture some poor fuller rubbing chalk dust into the folds while muttering under his breath about corrupt senators. And yet the toga's journey isn't finished. Clean fabric is just the beginning. To make it truly Roman, it must be folded, a process more art than science. As you cradle the freshly laundered cloth still warm from the sun, you can sense what's coming next. A battle of geometry, patience, and a little bit of social performance. You've got 7 meters of wool in your arms, and not a single instruction manual. A breeze carries away some of the lingering fuller's smell, leaving only the faint, earthy aroma of clay and wool. You stretch the toga out, running your fingers along its length, and realize this isn't just fabric. It's reputation. It's the visible marker of who you are, in a world where appearance mattered almost as much as ancestry. And soon it will test your folding skills in ways you never expected. You've now got the toga in your arms, clean, gleaming, and deceptively innocent. It looks harmless enough, just a big piece of wool. But don't let it fool you. Folding and draping this monster is the ancient Roman equivalent of assembling flat-pack furniture without the instruction booklet. You'll start off confident, then somewhere around fold number 3, you'll wish you'd just stuck to a simple tunic. Here's the mainstream fact. A standard toga was usually about 6 to 7 meters long and 2 meters wide. That's not clothing. That's a woolen topographical map. The art was in arranging it so that it looked natural yet stately, with one end tucked neatly over the shoulder and the other falling in dignified folds. Elite Romans hired dressers known as vestiplici to manage this ordeal. Ordinary citizens, they had to wrestle with it themselves. The quirky tidbit you might not expect archaeological and literary sources suggest that togas weren't symmetrical. The fabric wasn't cut into a perfect semicircle, but rather a kind of wonky oval designed to drape better on the human form. Which means, lucky you, even geometry won't save you here. Every toga had its own mood swings. One toga might hang like a dream, the next could bunch up like a sulking curtain. Historians still argue whether there was a universal fold taught to all Romans, or whether different households had their own regional quirks. Some evidence from statues suggests uniformity, but personal letters hint at endless frustration. Cicero, for instance, once complained about political candidates fussing endlessly with their toga folds to look more appealing in public. So was there a perfect fold? Or was everyone just winging it and hoping the wool gods were merciful? Now it's your turn. You lay the toga out flat, a woolen sea stretching wider than your bed. First you fold a small portion lengthwise to create a sturdy edge. This will be your anchor. Then comes the wrap, under the left arm, across the body, up over the shoulder, and around again. By now you're basically wrapped like an enormous burrito, and the toga is sliding downward with each breath. This is when you realize the toga was never designed for practicality. Try bending down to pick something up. Congratulations, you've just exposed half your chest and most of your dignity. Walking in it requires a slow shuffle, the kind that screams, "I am important because I cannot move quickly," running. Forget it. If a fire breaks out, you'll be cooked wool on wool. You glance into a polished bronze mirror. The folds look uneven, and the drape over your left arm resembles a sad curtain swag. You tug at it trying to smooth it down, but each adjustment shifts something else. It's like trying to make a bed while lying in it. A Roman friend chuckles nearby, offering to help, but you wave them off. No, you're determined to master this on your own. Pride, after all, is at stake. This is also where the social pressure kicks in. Romans judged each other not just by whether you wore a toga, but how well it was draped. Sloppy folds could suggest laziness, lack of refinement, or even disrespect toward the event you were attending. A toga that flowed in graceful curves, on the other hand, made you look like a marble statue come to life. Imagine showing up at the Senate with folds collapsing like a lopsided bedsheet. You'd be the joke of the day. For the wealthy, this stress was outsourced. The vestiplicus would hover nearby, adjusting folds before the master stepped into public view like a fashion stylist on the red carpet. You, however, keep fumbling with the wool sweating under the weight and muttering promises to yourself about inventing elastic someday. Eventually, you settle into a passable drape. It's not perfect one fold and sits on puffing out like a stubborn loaf of bread, but it'll do. The toga hugs your shoulder, cascades across your chest, and sways gently as you take a tentative step. Congratulations! You've now achieved what thousands of Roman citizens did daily. You've turned laundry into performance art. And yet, as you adjust a final fold, you catch yourself smiling. The toga is uncomfortable, impractical, and heavy, but it also transforms you. Standing there, you feel taller, more dignified, as if centuries of Roman tradition are stitched into the wool. You're no longer just someone fumbling with fabric. You're a participant in a ritual of appearance, a walking billboard of citizenship and status. But don't get too comfortable. Wearing the toga is only half the battle. Next comes where you actually go in it. And in Rome, toga-clad life wasn't about lounging at home. No, the toga was meant to be seen. And the first place you're expected to parade this woolen masterpiece, the forum. You shuffle out of your doorway toga, swaying heavily, and suddenly the street feels different. This isn't the sort of garment you wear to loiter unnoticed. Every fold announces, "Look at me, I'm Roman." You feel the eyes of neighbors, shopkeepers, and the occasional stray dog. Even the pigeons seem to pause, tilting their heads as if to say, "Well, that's ambitious." Here's the mainstream fact. The toga was not just a piece of clothing, it was a badge of citizenship. Foreigners, slaves, and women, except for a few ritual roles, didn't wear it. To put one on meant declaring, "I belong to this city, this community, this identity." It was a uniform of belonging. That's why you can't just throw it over your shoulder like a scarf. You're expected to honor it with proper draping and solemn dignity. The quirky tidbit Romans were so serious about toga etiquette that laws regulated who could wear which type. Candidates for office wore the toga candida whitened until it practically glowed like a toothpaste commercial. Boys wore the toga praetexta, with a purple border symbolizing youth and innocence. And generals, when granted the honor, might wear a purple-dyed toga picta, so outrageously expensive that it screamed power. You glance down at your own toga humble white and think, at least it doesn't make me look like a human grape. Historians still argue whether ordinary citizens actually wore togas regularly, or whether by the late Republic most preferred simpler tunics for everyday life. Some suggest the toga had already become more ceremonial, dragged out mainly for court appearances, festivals, or official business, which leaves you in an awkward spot. You might be overdressed just walking to the forum, like showing up at a cafe in a tuxedo. But you press on. The toga forces you into a dignified shuffle, and with each step you feel the hem tug and the folds shift slightly. You resist the urge to readjust, though you know Vestiplizzi would be horrified by the asymmetry creeping into your drape. Passing by a bakery, the smell of fresh bread wafts out, and you realize you can't even buy a loaf easily. The toga ties up one arm, leaving you with all the dexterity of a penguin at the market. You keep moving toward the Forum, Rome's buzzing public square. The closer you get, the thicker the crowd. Merchants shout, senators gossip in shaded porticos, children dart around playing games, and statues glare down at you as if judging your folding technique. You catch sight of a rival citizen's toga, perfectly balanced in its folds, the kind that drapes like a sculptor personally arranged it. You look back at yours, which now resembles a wrinkled curtain, and sigh. Still, there's something hypnotic about being part of this flow. The forum is a theater, and your toga is your ticket inside. Without it, you're an outsider. With it, you're one of many wool-wrapped actors in Rome's endless political and social drama. The toga makes you visible whether you like it or not. At one end of the square, a magistrate stands tall, his toga pristine and edged with purple, delivering some long-winded decree. You can't hear every word, but you notice how he gestures with controlled precision, careful not to dislodge a fold. Even power itself seems balanced on the draping of cloth. You glance around. Other citizens are adjusting their togas quietly, tugging at hems, fussing at folds, all trying to maintain dignity while pretending not to care. And yes, people are watching. The toga makes small things public: a crooked fold, a dusty hem, a sloppy drape. They're all social signals, like having spinach stuck in your teeth at a party. You become hyper-aware of your every movement, suddenly grateful for how slowly Romans like to walk. At one point, a friend greets you, tugging your toga affectionately, nearly undoing half your folds. You manage a stiff laugh while internally you're praying the wool doesn't unravel completely in front of the crowd. That's the nightmare, to suddenly stand in the forum naked, but for your tunic, your toga puddled at your feet like a sulking blanket. But somehow you hold it together. You weave through senators, priests, merchants, and clients. The toga is heavy, yes, but it's also armor. Each layer of wool is a reminder you're not just a body in a crowd, you're a citizen in Rome. And as the sun beats down, warming the fabric on your shoulders, you catch yourself thinking this silly, impractical garment has given you a strange sense of pride. Tomorrow, you'll complain about the weight, the heat, and the folds. Tonight, though, as you shuffle home from the forum, toga still mostly intact, you understand why Romans clung to it. It wasn't about comfort. It was about visibility. The toga made you someone worth seeing. The toga may have made you visible in the forum, but it also had another destiny ceremony. Because in Rome, the toga wasn't just everyday attire. It was practically a stage costume. You don't wear 7 meters of wool just to fetch olives at the market. No, the toga was saved for the moments when society itself was watching weddings, funerals, public sacrifices, trials, and political campaigns. Here's the mainstream fact. Roman boys, upon reaching manhood, exchanged their childhood toga praetexta for the plain white toga virilis in a ceremony that marked their transition into full citizenship. This moment was as symbolic as a modern graduation gown, except instead of tossing your cap in the air, you're stuck trying not to trip over your new woolen status. Families paraded their sons through the city toga, gleaming, announcing to the world, here is a citizen now. The quirky tidbit: at some funerals, mourners deliberately wore their togas in disarray folds, untidy hems dragging even tears in the fabric as a visible sign of grief. Imagine a whole crowd of toga wearers looking like they got dressed in the dark after a rough night. The toga could signal dignity, yes, but also sorrow and even protest, depending on how you folded or didn't fold it. Historians still argue whether every ritual required a toga or whether tunics sufficed for lower ceremonies. Evidence suggests that poorer citizens might have borrowed a toga for special occasions, much like renting a tuxedo today. But the debates remain: did the toga really dominate Roman ritual life? Or was it just the elite writing the rules in marble while everyone else quietly ignored them? You find yourself standing in a temple courtyard toga, arranged as best you can manage, the smell of incense hanging heavy in the warm air. Priests move about in carefully folded garments, their purple-bordered togas pristine. A goat bleats nervously nearby, unaware of its impending role in the sacrifice. You shift your weight, trying not to sweat through your wool as the priest raises his hand. Every gesture seems slowed, deliberate ceremonial folds adjusted between movements, as if the wool itself demanded reverence. Weddings carried their own drama. The bride often wore a flame-colored veil, while male guests appeared in togas, their folds neat and symmetrical. You imagine being seated among them wool, clinging in the summer heat, watching as two families negotiated not just love, but property alliances and dowries. A sloppy toga here might whisper disrespect toward the bride's family. The folds mattered. And then there were trials. Picture standing in a Roman court toga, heavy on your shoulders as you plead your case. Your opponent tugs his folds into order, presenting himself as calm, collected, trustworthy. You, meanwhile, feel sweat trickling under the wool. Every tug you make risks signaling nerves. Lawyers today might fret about ties or haircuts. Romans had to manage half a blanket while arguing for their freedom. You think back to funerals, though, where togas became messy on purpose. It's oddly comforting. The same garment that demanded perfection in life could be loosened, unraveled, even sullied in grief. The toga was versatile not just in drape, but in meaning, a symbol of life's milestones, both joyous and solemn, both polished and unkempt. As the evening ceremony ends, you leave the temple steps, toga folds, catching the dying light. Somewhere nearby, a boy celebrates his new toga virilis, while in another household, a toga lies crumpled in mourning. Wool binds them all together, across joy and sorrow, across beginnings and endings. You take a deep breath, shifting the folds once more, realizing that tonight, your toga isn't just clothing. It's a participant in history's endless rituals. The longer you wear the toga, the more you realize it's not just fabric, it's performance. And nowhere is that performance more exaggerated than in politics. Rome was a place where words, gestures, and folds of wool combined into a kind of theater, and if you couldn't manage them, you risked being laughed out of the forum. Here's the mainstream fact: political candidates wore a special toga, the toga candida. It wasn't merely white, it was chalked and brushed until it gleamed unnaturally, almost glowing. From this, we get our word, candidate. Imagine entire crowds of would-be politicians wandering Rome, looking like walking advertisements for laundry detergent. Now the quirky tidbit: some ambitious men rubbed extra chalk into their folds so vigorously that the dust would puff into the air as they moved, creating a halo effect. Was it dignity, or was it just ancient special effects? Hard to say. You imagine sneezing your way through a campaign speech while your toga sheds white clouds like a clumsy magician's trick. Historians still argue whether candidates truly spent all day in the forum showing off these radiant togas, or whether most of the glad-handing happened in private courtyards. Some inscriptions suggest constant public visibility, while skeptical scholars think that ordinary citizens weren't fooled by a fancy fold. You can't chalk away corruption, one commentator quipped centuries ago. And yet voters often seem dazzled by the crispness of a man's wool. You picture yourself standing in the forum during election season, toga arranged as neatly as possible. Candidates parade by, folds adjusted, just so hands extended in rehearsed gestures. One leans in, whispering promises of bread. Another boasts about his lineage, tugging at a stubborn hem as he speaks. The toga becomes part of the sales pitch. Neat, glowing folds suggest discipline and dignity, while sloppy draping might whisper carelessness. It's exhausting to watch. You can't help imagining a backstage area hidden behind colonnades where campaign assistants frantically chalk and redrape their masters like pit crews at a toga race. Somewhere, a vestiplicus is cursing under his breath, trying to smooth out folds while the candidate rehearses his speech about civic virtue. And you're caught between admiration and absurdity. The toga elevates these men, but it also traps them in a costume. You notice one poor candidate sweating rivers beneath his chalk-dusty wool, his smile frozen as he waves at the crowd. You can almost hear his inner monologue, just 30 more minutes. Don't faint. Don't faint in the toga. There's a strange comfort in realizing politics hasn't changed all that much. The slogans, the handshakes, the emphasis on appearances, it's all there wrapped in wool instead of silk ties. Only now you're watching it in real time, in the glare of the Mediterranean sun, the folds of Rome's democracy literally stitched together by sheep. By the time you shuffle away, you've seen enough chalk to last a lifetime. Your own toga feels heavier than ever, but you carry it differently now. You know it isn't just clothing, it's costume signal armor. And whether you're a senator, a candidate, or just a weary citizen in the forum, the wool speaks before you do. By now, you've marched through forums, endured ceremonies, and even witnessed political chalk dust campaigns. But there's one thing you can't ignore any longer. The toga is heavy, really heavy, and Rome, in case you hadn't noticed, is hot. You feel the sun beating down on your wool like you're a loaf of bread left to rise in the oven. Here's the mainstream fact. A toga could weigh several kilograms depending on the quality and weave. Combine that with Rome's Mediterranean summers, and you have the recipe for a personal sauna. Ancient writers grumbled about it too. One senator called the toga a burden of dignity, which is a polite way of saying, I'm sweating buckets, but can't take it off. Now for the quirky tidbit, some Romans used creative tricks to deal with the heat. A few stuffed sprigs of herbs or even tiny bits of scented wax into their folds, so the smell of sweat wouldn't be so obvious. Others supposedly carried slaves with fans to keep air moving beneath the wool. You imagine yourself bribing a child to walk alongside waving palm fronds at your armpits while you pretend it's all terribly dignified. Historians still argue whether citizens wore togas daily or mostly reserved them for public events. Some evidence suggests tunics were far more practical for everyday life, while the toga became increasingly symbolic over time. Was it a genuine daily uniform, or more like a ceremonial straitjacket? The debate continues, but your damp wool right now suggests the tunic crowd had the right idea. You trudge along Rome's sun-drenched streets, feeling your folds sag with sweat. The wool sticks to your skin in unpleasant patches, and every time you adjust it, the toga seems to laugh, sliding off your shoulder with a smug little shimmy. You mutter something unrepeatable about sheep. A vendor selling chilled wine offers you a cup, and for a moment you consider pouring it down your toga instead of drinking it. There's comedy in it, of course, watching dignified senators shuffling slowly through the heat, sweat dripping down their temples, pretending all is well. It's like a silent play of woolen misery. The toga forced everyone to look calm, even while internally they were praying to Jupiter for a breeze. And when a breeze did arrive, oh, the folds would billow magnificently like sails on a ship, making the wearer look noble instead of merely overheated. You take shelter under a colonnade, finally able to breathe. The shade cools you slightly, though your wool is still warm to the touch. You notice others doing the same, citizens fanning themselves with scrolls, children darting about in simple tunics, free of woolly burdens. You envy them, but you also notice the way passers-by glance at you with respect, however brief. That's the trade-off sweat for status. And the toga is stubborn. Even as you fantasize about tearing it off and diving into a fountain, you know you won't. You'll endure it because that's what Romans did. They suffered under wool to show they belonged. You feel like you've joined a long line of sweaty citizens, each one secretly wishing they could invent shorts. By the time you step back into the sunlight, you're drenched, but you straighten your folds anyway. Dignity. First, comfort second. It's the Roman way. And as the sun glares down, you can't help but laugh softly. Who knew history's great empire was held together, not just by legions and laws, but by stubborn people refusing to admit their clothes were unbearable? You shuffle through the forum once again, your toga still clinging like a determined barnacle, and suddenly a thought strikes you. Who decided this was a good idea in the first place? The answer lies in Rome's obsession with identity. The toga wasn't just clothing, it was a badge, a uniform, a symbol, carved out of wool. Romans believed it was the defining garment of their civilization. Greeks had their chitons, barbarians had their trousers. But the toga, that was Roman. To wear one was to shout silently, "I am a citizen of Rome." Of course not. Everyone was allowed to join in the woolly misery. Slaves couldn't wear them. Foreigners couldn't either. Even free-born non-citizens had no right. This made the toga an exclusive club, where entry required legal status, political rights, and apparently a willingness to overheat. The symbolism ran deeper. Different togas meant different things. The toga virilis, plain white, no frills, signaled that a boy had become a man. The toga praetexta, with its fancy purple stripe, marked senators and magistrates, and the rare toga picta, dyed deep crimson and embroidered with gold, was reserved for generals during triumphs or emperors who wanted to look extra impressive, like a walking tapestry of power. But here's the practical joke. All this symbolism relied on wool that stained, sagged, and frayed easily. One spilled goblet of wine at a feast, and your status symbol turned into a blotchy mess. Imagine being a senator, dripping in prestige, and then tripping over your own toga into a bowl of garum fish sauce. Respect gone in an instant. Historians point out that the strict rules of toga wearing might have been more flexible in real life. While law books and moralists demanded certain folds, everyday Romans probably fudged the details. A toga worn loosely at home might look more like a blanket than a political statement. Some scholars even think Romans complained about togas so much because they were rarely worn like modern people complaining about suits. The loudest groaning might come from those forced to put one on only for special occasions. Still, the toga clung to Rome's identity for centuries. It was paraded at ceremonies, carved into marble statues, immortalized in frescoes. Even emperors who could wear whatever they wanted often chose the toga in public as a reminder of continuity with old traditions. It was wool, spun into propaganda draped across generations. And so here you stand sweating quietly in your folds, realizing you are part of something bigger than fashion. You're wrapped in history's favorite symbol of Romanness. A hot, itchy, impractical symbol, yes, but one that once carried the weight of empire. As you move through the crowd, you notice eyes glance your way again. They aren't staring at you, but at the toga itself. It's less about who you are and more about what you're wearing. You've become a walking billboard of citizenship, privilege, and duty. And though your shoulders ache from the wool's weight, you feel oddly proud. Still, you mutter under your breath, next time I'm inventing shorts. You've been wandering long enough to realize something important. These folds don't just hang, they speak. Every pleat whispers a message. Every drape carries unspoken meaning. And if you think this sounds a little overdramatic, well, so did the Romans. But they still believed it. Consider the toga's drapery like an ancient version of emojis. A certain angle might suggest dignity, another casual ease. The way the cloth pooled at your feet could be read as either graceful or sloppy, depending on who was judging. In a society obsessed with appearances, toga folds became a silent conversation. Take the gesture of drawing the edge of your toga over your head. That wasn't just to keep the sun out of your eyes, it signaled piety. At religious rituals, priests and even ordinary citizens would tug the wool across their scalp, a gesture that said, I'm serious, I'm sacred, and yes, I'm currently suffocating in wool for the gods. The courtroom offered another layer of toga theatrics. Advocates often exaggerated their folds, arranging them for maximum drama. Cicero himself was said to flick his toga, just so punctuating speeches with swishes of wool like an actor on stage. Imagine standing before a jury, not just with words, but with 6 meters of fabric weaponized into body language. It's basically the Roman version of PowerPoint slides, only heavier. Then there's the matter of color and texture. Most togas were undyed white, practical, only if your life didn't involve walking dusty streets. But brighter or fancier versions existed. Some historians argue that poorer citizens often wore simpler, shorter versions, almost like blankets wrapped fast. The elite, meanwhile, fussed endlessly about purity of wool, brilliance of whiteness, and smoothness of folds. Status dripped from thread count. A quirky tidbit, there's evidence that actors in Roman comedies sometimes mocked the toga by exaggerating its folds until they looked ridiculous. Picture an oversized wool avalanche swamping a stage. The audience laughed because everyone knew the struggle was real. And yet, debates linger. Did every Roman truly read folds like coded signals? Or is that our modern imagination over-interpreting? Historians still argue whether toga symbolism was a consistent language across society, or more like fashion, somewhat vague, mostly pretentious, and easily misunderstood. You shuffle forward, tugging at your own drapery. It suddenly occurs to you that someone might be reading into your posture right now. Is that sagging hem an insult to Jupiter? Is the slouch in your shoulder a subtle political stance? You sigh, realizing you may have just committed wool-based blasphemy without even noticing. And the toga's heaviness only adds to the act. Holding your arm in place, keeping the folds arranged, projecting dignity while balancing sweaty fabric, this was theater disguised as daily life. Every Roman citizen who donned a toga became for a moment both actor and audience, draped in the expectations of society. You pass by a statue of a senator, chiseled forever in flawless folds, marble drapery falling like water. You mutter under your breath, cheating. Real wool never sits that nicely. The sculptor, of course, omitted the sweat stains, the crooked corners, and the itch. Art always lies a little, and so you carry on aware that with every step, you're not just walking, you're performing, embodying an empire stitched together in wool. The sun has dipped lower, and you find yourself walking past a cluster of temples where priests glide in their perfectly draped togas, each fold arranged as carefully as the incense offerings on the altar. You pause, half convinced these men must have secret folding squads, hidden in the shadows, ready to readjust their wool mid-ritual. The truth, though, is that folding togas was often a communal act, slaves, family members, even friends lending extra hands. You can't wrangle 6 meters of wool alone unless you want to spend the afternoon trapped like a moth in curtains. Roman families treated the toga almost like a shared heirloom, passed down, patched up, whitened with chalk dust, or even treated with clay to restore its brightness. A toga could live through multiple generations. Imagine opening a family chest and pulling out the same toga Grandpa wore to vote in the Republic, only now it's your turn to sweat through it at a local festival. A legacy, yes, but also a laundry nightmare. In wealthier households, toga folding was a ritual in itself. Slaves might practice the art daily, studying where to tuck, how to balance the drape across the left arm, how to let the fabric fall into a clean semicircle. Think of it as a couture fitting session, except the runway is the Senate steps and the audience is grumpy senators judging your hemline. There's a quirky note in some writing's chalk, and even urine were used in laundry to whiten fabric. That means when you wore your pure toga to a religious ceremony, you might have been wrapped in yesterday's, well, let's call it recycled whiteness. You wrinkle your nose, grateful this detail isn't inscribed on the marble walls of temples. Historians still argue whether all Romans actually wore their togas properly, or if most just gave up and draped them like oversized shawls. Some evidence suggests that even senators sometimes muttered about the impracticality, while ordinary folk quietly reserved togas for official duties, ditching them for tunics when nobody important was looking. Your footsteps echo through the temple courtyard. You watch a young man nervously trying to adjust his toga before approaching a priest. The folds keep slipping. The edge droops dangerously close to the ground, and his face burns redder than the sacrificial wine. You recognize the feeling immediately. It's the same panic as forgetting your tie before a big interview. The toga, you realize, wasn't just clothing. It was a constant rehearsal of belonging. Each fold you practiced, each adjustment you made, was a way of reminding yourself and everyone else that you were part of Rome, that you carried the weight, literal and figurative, of citizenship. And as night begins to press against the horizon, you sense that the wool draped over your shoulder has somehow grown heavier, not from sweat or dust, but from the invisible expectations woven into every fiber. The toga doesn't just hang on you, it watches you. It whispers Rome's demands. And like everyone else, you nod and keep walking, pretending it's only fabric. By the time you drift toward the bustle of the forum, the toga has fully claimed its role as both costume and character. You can't help but notice how every man's drapery sets him apart. The crisp folds of magistrates who stride like marble statues come to life. The slightly uneven layers of shopkeepers who clearly had to rush, and the carefully fussed-over perfection of young aristocrats, hoping someone important notices their wool. Togas weren't one-size-fits-all in meaning. They spoke to identity the way modern uniforms do. Senators wore the toga praetexta with its purple border subtle but impossible to miss. It wasn't just dye, it was a walking billboard screaming, "I matter more than you." Generals after victory donned the toga picta, dyed deep crimson, embroidered with gold so radiant it practically blinded bystanders. Ordinary citizens, meanwhile, were left with the plain, chalky white toga virilis, more humble, but still heavy with symbolic weight. The toga also marked life's transitions. A boy put on his first toga virilis around age 16, an event celebrated with rituals and offerings. That wool wasn't just fabric, it was a milestone, a declaration that childhood had slipped away. Parents watched proudly while the boy silently cursed the itchy material and wondered how to walk without tripping. Here's a quirky note. Some Romans actually rented togas for special occasions. Yes, toga rental shops existed. Imagine planning a wedding and popping by the local wool lender to pick out your size like tuxedos, but sweatier. Historians still argue whether these shops catered mostly to poorer citizens or if even wealthier Romans occasionally relied on them when their own togas were too worn. Either way, toga rental feels oddly modern, like the Roman Empire's proto-fast fashion, and yet symbolism cut deeper than practicality. The toga's whiteness suggested moral purity, an ideal that clashed spectacularly with the actual lives of senators who bribed, schemed, and occasionally plotted assassinations while swaddled in virtue. The irony was as visible as the folds themselves. You wander into a shaded portico where two older men debate heatedly, not with raised voices, but with flicks of their togas. One adjusts his hem in a show of impatience, the other tugs the fold over his arm like a curtain of authority. You realize their fabric speaks almost as loudly as their words. Body language wrapped in wool. Even funerals relied on toga symbolism. Some families displayed a deceased man's toga folded carefully as a reminder of his status. Others draped statues in togas to honor lineage. The folds themselves became a language of remembrance. And of course, the emperor's toga was its own universe. Gilded, embroidered, impossibly heavy, it demanded attention. Historians still argue how often emperors wore these ceremonial monstrosities in daily life. Likely, they saved them for parades and public spectacles when the empire itself needed to shimmer in fabric form. So, as you meander through the marketplace surrounded by wool, chalk dust, and chatter, you realize every toga here is more than clothing. Each fold is a proclamation, a whisper of who stands where in the Roman order. And you, too, are wrapped in that silent hierarchy, every step a reminder that in Rome, identity was draped, displayed, and never optional. The forum quiets as evening settles and you wander away from the crowd tugging at your folds once more. By now, the toga feels less like clothing and more like a traveling companion, clingy, demanding, and prone to tripping you at inopportune moments. And yet, beneath the grumbling, you've begun to sense why Romans clung to it for centuries. The toga was a badge, but it was also a barrier. It separated citizen from slave Roman, from foreigner, insider from outsider. If you wore the wool, you carried Rome's weight. If you didn't, you stood at the margins. It's astonishing, really, how 6 meters of cloth could define entire lives. But wearing the toga wasn't simply about walking through markets or attending ceremonies. It infiltrated leisure politics, even flirtation. Picture this: a young Roman lounging at a banquet, carefully arranging his folds to reveal just enough of his tunic beneath. Was it comfort, maybe? Was it also style? Definitely. The toga became part of courtship, an accessory to charm or impress. A neatly managed fold could whisper tidiness and self-control, while a sloppy drape might hint at reckless abandon. It's the ancient equivalent of choosing sneakers versus polished shoes for a date. Quirky tidbit: some Romans wrote about the toga as though it had moods of its own. Pliny the Elder once described garments that refused to hold their fold, falling again and again until the wearer gave up. Was it a joke or a genuine observation? Historians still argue whether such rebellious togas were metaphorical or just badly laundered wool. You wander past a fountain where a group of children chase each other in miniature tunics, their fathers adjusting togas nearby. One man stops to fix his friend's fold, tucking it back into place with the precision of a tailor. It strikes you, the toga demanded collaboration. To fold it properly was to trust someone else's hands. In a culture obsessed with hierarchy, the act of draping wool became strangely intimate. Of course, not everyone embraced the toga's demands. By the later empire, many Romans abandoned it for more practical cloaks. Writers complained bitterly, accusing citizens of neglecting tradition, of letting the symbol of Rome fade away. The toga became less common in daily life, surviving mostly for official occasions. Imagine senators scolding younger generations. Back in my day, we wore wool in the blazing sun, and we liked it. As twilight deepens, you find yourself thinking about all the silent stories hidden in each fold. A boy stepping into manhood, a senator polishing his status, a grieving family remembering their dead. The toga wasn't just a garment. It was a diary in wool, each pleat recording who you were and who you pretended to be. And so you walk your own folds, swishing faintly against the stone path. You start to feel oddly proud of the wool, as if you finally mastered its language, even though your left shoulder itches and your hem has collected half the city's dust. Maybe that's the real Roman experience, not dignity or glory, but simply enduring the fabric long enough to belong. Night drapes itself over the city like another fold of wool, and the lamps along the street flicker to life, casting soft halos on marble walls. You slow your pace, the toga heavy but strangely comforting now, as though it has absorbed not just sweat but memory, clinging to you with the persistence of history itself. You notice how the streets have quieted. The clamor of the forum has faded into murmurs, leaving only the scrape of sandals and the hum of cicadas. In this half-dark, the toga feels different, less costume, more cocoon. It muffles your movements, wrapping you in silence, as though Rome itself is encouraging you to drift into stillness. Yet even in the hush of evening, the toga remains a social script. At banquets, guests reclined on couches careful to arrange their folds so the wool didn't spill awkwardly across the table. Picture a host adjusting his toga while lifting a goblet of watered wine, trying not to look ridiculous while pretending this arrangement is perfectly natural. Historians still argue whether Romans genuinely found this dignified or whether everyone silently cursed their clothing while nibbling olives. A quirky detail, togas were sometimes perfumed for special occasions. Oils and scents might be rubbed into the wool, giving it a fragrance far more pleasant than its usual chalk and urine-cleaned aroma. You imagine a room full of perfumed togas, the air thick with rose and myrrh, a far cry from the sweaty marketplace you trudged through earlier, and in quieter corners of Roman life, the toga became a kind of background actor. Children played at wearing miniature versions during festivals. Actors on stage parodied the folds to mock the elite, and satirists scribbled jokes about men who tripped over their hymns. You can almost hear the chuckles of audiences watching some poor fellow stagger across the stage, swallowed by wool. You wander past a colonnade where shadows gather thick. In the stillness, you recall statues frozen in their perfect drapery. They were carved to outlast the men who wore them immortal folds that never sag, never wrinkle, never itch. But you know better now. You've felt the drag, the imbalance, the tugging weight. Those marble folds are lies carved in stone, an ideal that no Roman ever truly mastered. And maybe that's the point. The toga was never meant to be easy. It was meant to remind you of the effort of belonging, the constant work of looking Roman enough, dignified enough, proper enough. It was a garment that demanded presence. As you walk into the deepening night, you realize the toga's story is less about fashion and more about endurance. You wear it not because it's comfortable, but because it connects you to something larger, a city, a people, an empire that stitched itself together in folds of wool. And as the stars prick through the Roman sky, you feel your own steps slowing your body, settling beneath the weight of cloth and time. The toga sways gently with each breath, no longer a burden, but a lullaby in fabric, urging you toward stillness. The streets are hushed now, as though the entire city has been wrapped in its own toga of silence. Your sandals scrape lightly on the stones, and the folds of wool around you sway with each slow step. The toga, once a nuisance, has softened into a blanket of night, its edges brushing your skin like a quiet reminder that every wrinkle carries a story. You find yourself wandering past doorways where lamplight spills into the road, golden against the shadows. Families gather behind those walls, their togas folded neatly over pegs, resting until morning. Perhaps a boy's toga virilis waits for its first festival. Perhaps a senator's chalk-whitened toga hangs heavy ready to parade authority again tomorrow. Each garment slumbers with its owner, a companion in both duty and rest. You tug your wool closer, breathing in its faint, earthy scent. It smells of chalk dust and the faint sweetness of oil rubbed into its fibers. Oddly, the aroma comforts you. Like the hum of cicadas, it grounds you in this moment, reminding you that beneath the grandeur of Rome lay the simple rhythms of cloth sweat and the human desire to belong. A quirky thought crosses your mind. Did Romans ever secretly sigh in relief when they slipped off their togas at night. Historians still argue whether most citizens truly wore them daily or whether the wool was mostly for ceremony. Either way, you can picture the quiet joy of stepping out of 6 meters of fabric, finally free to breathe, finally free to lie down without being cocooned in obligation. You settle onto a stone bench, letting your toga drape around you like a blanket. Overhead, the stars prick brighter, distant, and eternal, as if stitched into the sky by the same invisible hand that folds wool across shoulders. Rome seems smaller in this moment, quieter, almost gentle. You exhale slowly, and for the first time, the toga feels less like Rome's demand and more like Rome's embrace. You let your eyelids sink. The fabric cushions you each fold, smoothing into the next, each crease melting into shadow. Somewhere nearby, the city exhales too, and in the hush of night, wrapped in 6 meters of wool and 2,000 years of memory, you drift into stillness. Word count 1059. Wind down 300 words. And so, with the city asleep and the folds of your toga resting gently across your body, you let the last sounds of Rome fade into the distance. The echoes of footsteps, the murmurs of markets, the weight of expectation, they soften now, as though time itself has loosened its grip. You are no longer tugging at hems or worrying about folds. The wool has settled. It has become weightless, like mist, draped not on your shoulders, but across your dreams. Each breath carries you deeper into calm. Each exhale smoothing the fabric of the day into something quieter, gentler, easier to bear. The marble statues stand frozen, their impossible folds gleaming in the starlight. But you know the truth that perfection is only stone's illusion. Real fabric shifts, real lives wrinkle, and in that imperfection lies comfort. Tonight, you are free to let your own folds loosen, free to release the need for symmetry or order. The air is cool, the night steady. Perhaps you hear a faint fountain somewhere, water spilling softly into its basin, a lullaby in ripples. Perhaps you hear only your own breathing, slow and sure, the rhythm of a body finally at rest. Let the toga become your blanket, not a burden. Let the folds cradle you, not command you. Drift with them, drift beyond them, until the weight of history itself feels light enough to float away. And as the last lamps gutter out, leaving only the stars above you, close your eyes fully. Rome is quiet now, and so are you.